Good morning, and thank you for joining us at our Westside Economic Alliance November Forum as we enter this wonderful holiday season. We know your time is valuable, and we thank you for sharing it with us. I would like to recognize Legacy Health as our series sponsor, as well as Kaiser Permanente, our presenting sponsor. And I'd also like to start by recognizing all of our elected officials in attendance today. And next, I'd like to recognize the Westside Economic Alliance Board of Directors in attendance today. And on behalf of Legacy Health, I have some remarks. Legacy Health would like to call your attention to two important health updates. Pediatric vaccines are now available in Oregon for children 5 to 11 years old. Vaccines are our best tool to ensure that children can continue to participate in normal activities like attending school in person and safely spending time with family and friends. To find out more about getting your child vaccinated, please contact your pediatrician or family primary care doctor. As you've likely heard, there is a critical blood shortage facing Oregon hospitals right now. The pandemic has deeply exacerbated this problem. Patients are in dire need of life-saving blood donations. If you are able to donate blood, Legacy Health asks that you make an appointment with their trusted partner, BloodWorks Northwest. Visit BloodWorks Northwest online and book your appointment today. Your gift of blood saves lives. Thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce Jason Snyder from Kaiser Permanente, and he will be saying a few remarks.
Good morning, Westside Economic Alliance. Many of you probably know me as the mayor of Tigard. Fewer may know that I work full-time at Kaiser Permanente, and I'm here today in my role as the director of the general and plastic surgery practices at Kaiser Permanente Northwest. As you likely saw in recent news, Kaiser Permanente and the Alliance of Healthcare Unions reached a 4-year national agreement covering nearly 50,000 Kaiser Permanente healthcare employees in 22 local unions in Oregon, Washington, and California. In light of this, the Alliance unions canceled their strike notifications. Employees represented by the Alliance unions will vote on the tentative agreement over the next several weeks. And perhaps most importantly for all of you, and particularly Mayor Callaway, without a strike, you won't have to endure me providing direct patient care. This landmark agreement positions Kaiser Permanente for a successful future, focused on providing high-quality healthcare that is affordable and accessible for our members. It also maintains industry-leading wages and benefit packages for our Alliance represented employees. Kaiser Permanente and the Alliance are part of the longest running, most successful, and most innovative labor management partnership in the nation. This agreement is a testament to our long history with our partnership unions and is an example of how effective our partnership is when we work together. We are confident we will continue to move forward stronger together to further our mission and keep Kaiser Permanente a great place to work and to receive care. In other good news, we recently announced that Kaiser Permanente donated $25,000 each to the Beaverton, Hillsborough, Portland, and Salem school districts to help improve health for teachers, staff, students, and communities. The funding will help launch the Planning for the Next Normal at School playbook, a Kaiser Permanente Thriving Schools resource with actionable steps for schools and districts to prioritize health and well-being while navigating the challenges of both in-person and virtual school environments. The Beaverton School District is offering restorative practices and trauma-informed care training for staff, while the Hillsborough School District is addressing COVID response, social drivers of health, and racial equity by supporting a health navigator to connect families with resources. Of course, being Kaiser Permanente, it's important for me to remind everyone that our hospitals remain full and we still have a relatively high number of COVID patients. We continue to need the community's support in getting people vaccinated and following safety practices, especially as we move into the winter holiday season, where we know there will be more indoor gathering. gatherings. We continue to provide COVID-19 vaccines to those ages 5 and up, as well as COVID-19 booster shots and flu vaccines. Kaiser Permanente members can sign up for vaccinations at kp.org. Back to you, Gail.
Thank you, Jason. It is now my pleasure to introduce Josh Lehner. Josh is an economist with the State of Oregon's Office of Economic Analysis and no stranger to WEA. He develops the quarterly Oregon economic forecast, including outlooks for employment, income, and housing. Josh also acts as the state's de facto vice economist by forecasting revenues for the Oregon Lottery, Oregon Judicial Department, and state marijuana and tobacco taxes. Josh's economic research has been cited by Calculated Risk, The Economist, Financial Times, National Public Radio, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and other leading and local media, including the Westside Economic Alliance's News and Notes newsletter. Prior to joining the state, he worked as a research analyst for a local economic development organization and published a paper on border tax effect between Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Josh earned his BA in economics from the University of Colorado and MS in economics, master's in economics from Portland State University. And outside of work, Josh enjoys spending time with and traveling with his wife and children. Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Gail. It's a pleasure to be back with the group again. We just released our latest economic and revenue forecast yesterday afternoon, and I'm here to kind of walk through some of the high level points of that. And the big picture is, things continue to boom even more than expected. We've definitely what you could call, we're now in an inflationary boom, not just a strong recovery from the economy. We're in a strong recovery from the recession, and the pandemic. But given federal policies put in place, given consumer demand, given the supply constraints that we're facing, we are certainly seeing a lot more inflation, more persistent inflation than anticipated. I was going back and I was looking at what we chatted about. I was last with the group in May after our May forecast, and I was reading through the slides and reading through our document at the time. And what we did is we spent pages talking about the risk of inflation. We knew we had these capacity constraints. We knew we had labor constraints. We knew we had all this sort of stuff. And it was like the pieces are in place for more persistent, higher inflation than anticipated. But the belief was still largely it'd be transitory, it'd be temporary, that the supply chain stuff would get worked out, the pandemic would improve, people could go back to work, all that sort of stuff. And I still think, by and large, that might be the baseline outlook, that a lot of what we're seeing on the inflation front is temporary and will come off a little bit. But is it going to come off all the way back down to 2%, which is the Federal Reserve target? And that is really harder to know. And it's harder to say for sure that we think that'll happen, anytime soon, right? And we'll talk more about inflation in a minute. But the point here is with this strong income, strong consumer spending, strong demand environment, and the higher inflation, it means everything, top line numbers that are not adjusted for inflation, nominal income, nominal spending, nominal business revenue, are just booming, much more so than anticipated. That means tax collections, which we tax gross receipts now with our corporate activity tax and the like. That means top line revenues are growing faster than anticipated, in large part because of the inflationary environment, where you can pass along your cost increases to consumers because they have the money and they're ready to spend. But so what's going on, biggest thing, development in the economy right now is the labor market, where we have employment on the left is 4% below peak. We're still 73,000 jobs short of where we were pre-pandemic. We're more like 6% below forecast. That dotted line is our pre-pandemic forecast. So we're more like 100,000 jobs short of where we thought we would be before COVID hit. That said, total wages and salaries earned by those fewer workers, total wages and salaries are 8% above peak and above our pre-pandemic expectations. We have raised our income forecast. We have raised our wages and salaries forecast stronger than we thought it was 20 months ago before COVID, because of this labor market environment. Average wages in Oregon are up 15%. I don't know if you listened yesterday, I kept saying 12%. It's 15%. I used the wrong number, but it's 15%. Right? Average wages, the average worker in Oregon in wages are up 15% relative to pre-pandemic. Now we would have thought it was, up 8 or 9%. Just give, tight, we had a tight labor market in 2019. See 4 or 5% wage growth was pretty normal, but now we're up 15%, much faster than anticipated. And this has a lot of implications. It means that businesses have never paid a higher wage bill. Your labor costs have never been larger. It means household incomes are continuing to grow despite the federal aid gone, right? The recovery rebates are done. The unemployment insurance benefits are gone. Well, who knows if the child tax credit is going to get extended at the federal level and the like, right? So I think, this underlying wage growth really is going to be in the driver's seat for household incomes, which is good news for consumers in their ability to spend on rent, spend on housing, spend on clothing and cars and all that sort of stuff as that supply chain stuff normalizes. And the other thing to point out here is a little bit counterintuitive or a little bit ironic, is that the really strong wage growth for current workers means if there's a second adult in the household, whether it's a spouse or partner or just roommate situation, whatever it is, if the one person who's already working is seeing really strong wage gains, it means the other person doesn't need to come back to work as quickly to pay the bills because the one person's earning enough money, right? And so the ironic thing is that the really strong wage gains is going to hold down that labor supply a little bit longer than we thought 3, 6, 9 months ago. And so the workers are returning to the workforce. We're seeing strong job growth. We have strong job growth in the forecast. It's just a little bit slower than we would have thought 6 months ago. We thought people would come back a little faster than they have, but they're still going to come back. They are still coming back. It's just these things take longer than anticipated. And so, as I was saying, the big thing that the tip of everybody's tongue lately is this inflation environment, right? Where inflation is, in the nicest way, inflation is running 2 to 3% faster than the Federal Reserve would like. The latest print we got for October consumer price index at the national level and for the West Coast region too, is in double-digit territory. If whatever happened in October, if that happened for 12 months in a row, we're talking 11% inflation, which is really big. And some of this is tied to specific things related to the pandemic, reopening the economy. Airfares have surged, hotel prices have surged. We have specific bottlenecks in the automobile industry where you can't get the computer chips to finish the product. So prices of new and used cars are up 30, 40%. That sort of stuff's temporary, right? Airfares are not going to continue to go through the roof by double-digit rates every single year, right? We know automobile prices are going to level out when we get the supply chains fixed and the semiconductor issues fixed. So that stuff's temporary for sure, but the inflationary pressures are broader than that. And I think moving forward, what we really need to keep an eye on are rents, right? Housing prices went crazy in line with income growth and low interest rates, not too much crazy beyond that. And now rents are starting to rise as well. And rents are a persistent, sticky part of inflationary pressures. Those are starting to rise across the country. That's going to feed into the things the Federal Reserve cares about. The ultimate risk here is that the Federal Reserve will have to raise interest rates sharply to cool the economy and head off this inflation, which could tip us back into recession. And so we've now modeled a boom bust scenario I'll get to in a little bit, because this is a risk that economists are recognizing to a greater degree now than at any point in recent decades. And so, this is something that we're worried about, in part because it also has real concerns, right? There's real impacts here. We're looking at that average wage growth up 15% in Oregon since the start of the pandemic, but in inflation adjusted terms, real wages are only up 8%. So that inflation is starting to take away half of those gains. And you can see in the dark blue line here, it's kind of been negative the last couple of quarters, right? Inflation adjusted incomes are declining in the last 6 months, a little bit, not terribly so, but a little bit. And so that's really what people are starting to feel. It's like, yeah, I'm getting pay increases at work, but I'm also paying more at the store. And so it's starting to erode some of these wage gains. And really, you can see our outlook for inflation adjusted wages is flat for the next year, right? It's not until 2023 that we really start to see these wage gains increase, real wage gains increase again as some of those inflationary pressures subside. So that's a risk. There's a real cost associated with inflation. Now, even in this environment where the average worker is seeing slower real wage gains, we're seeing some wage compression. Workers in the bottom end of the spectrum, workers in particular that are less than $20 an hour type workers, are still seeing faster wage gains. They're still seeing real income growth. Their wages are rising faster than the rate of inflation. It's kind of everybody in the middle or upper end of the spectrum, where their wages aren't rising quite as fast as inflation. And so we're getting this wage compression broadly speaking, a reduction in wage inequality can be a good thing from a societal and economic perspective, even in this high inflation environment. Although, of course, if you're not in that bottom end and you're seeing those real wage declines, it doesn't feel good, and people are really pessimistic about it. And you can see that in the consumer surveys and the like, of where consumer sentiment is plunging because inflation is up, not because the economy per se is bad, but because we're seeing some higher prices at the pump and higher prices at the store and the like. Now, what does this mean for businesses? It means we're in this record pricing environment, right? Corporate profits today are at record highs, both in dollar terms, in inflation adjusted dollar terms, and profit margins, right? Profit margins are the highest they've been on record with this data. Here we're looking at 60 years of data, right? Profit margins are up about 5 percentage points. About 3 percentage points of that, 3 to 4 percentage points of that is pushing on cost increases, right? Labor costs are up, production costs are up, material costs are up, everything's up. But the prices to consumers are up even more, expanding profit margins because of the record pricing environment, because people have money and they're willing to spend. A little bit of the profit margins have also increased in that if you had existing inventory laying around and you sold it during the pandemic, you made a profit on that too. And so that has boosted the margins a little bit. They've goosed them a little bit more. That also means that's good news for the future, because if you run down your inventories like we have, that means we have to produce a lot more stuff to replenish those inventories. That's a driver of economic growth. And so this means, right, this means business revenues are up. This means consumer sales are up. This means profits are up, and corporate taxes and all that sort of stuff is really an important component here. Now, eventually, consumers are going to stop eating these price increases. Eventually, consumers are going to start to bulk, and that's called demand destruction, where the prices rise so much that people start buying less. Hasn't happened yet because we have those really strong incomes from the federal aid, but eventually that'll happen. I think these margins will come back down. Businesses won't be able to pass along all their cost increases, but we're not there yet. Right now, we're still able to. We just saw, I think this morning, we've seen some not necessarily records, but we're seeing really, really strong above estimates for some retailers, Macy's and Dillard's and stuff like that, right, are reporting on Wall Street, and their margins are up and their sales are up and their earnings are up much more than anticipated. So we're not there yet in terms of the not being able to pass along cost increases, but this is also contributing to the overall dynamics in the economy and tax revenues. Now, that said, so great news is from a business perspective for most businesses, not of course if you're a movie theater, not of course if you're a Saturday market vendor or something like that, where you're still restricted. But from a financial perspective, the profits are offsetting the day-to-day running challenges of running a business. But those day-to-day challenges from a corporate perspective, from a business perspective, have never been larger, certainly in recent decades. You guys might be familiar with the Standard Misery Index, this old thing that was created in the 1960s, became popularized in the 70s and 80s. It's just the inflation rate plus the unemployment rate. So how are households doing? What are they facing in terms of job prospects and what they have to pay when they go to the store? Well, we created a corporate misery index, which is the inflation, the cost of production increases, plus the job opening rate, the labor constraints, right? Trying to figure it out. And if we look at Oregon, the bubble chart on the right, looking at the different sectors, right? So depending upon which sector you're in, you're facing these issues to a greater degree or lesser degree than the overall economy. Now, I think pretty much every sector is struggling with labor. Labor market is tight, has been tight for a really long time now. Labor is not really going to become that much easier to get, but I think it'll ease a little bit. But there's different ranges of severity here, going from high severity to extreme severity, so to speak. And then the cost pressures in terms of production on the vertical axis up and down. And those are based on US data. We don't have great Oregon data for that. But you can see the goods producing industries, manufacturing, construction, right? They're seeing big increases in cost pressures, and they're having labor constraints. Leisure, out there on the right, having the biggest labor challenges, but maybe not so much on the cost front as much as some of the other sectors. Not that prices at the restaurants aren't going up, they are, and the labor costs are going up, but maybe not quite as much as some of those other industries. And then the other one I point out is transportation, warehousing, utilities, the yellow one at the top, right? Cost of logistics are through the roof, right? Warehousing space is really hard to come by. Vacancy rates are plunging, rents are rising from a physical space perspective. A logistic cost of freight transportation and the like is also really, really high right now. It costs a lot of money to move product. And so those cost pressures for the industry are really, really strong, the strongest we see in the economy. And their labor constraints aren't quite as bad as elsewhere. What's going on there? I think a lot of that has to speak with the fact that these distribution centers, are paying good wages, or at least better than a lot of other industries. They're paying $18, $20 an hour for starting wages in the warehousing industry today. And so, excuse me, that means they're able to draw in workers. We've added 6,000 warehousing and storage jobs in Oregon in recent years. We've added a ton of employment to these industries, and some of it are the big distribution centers, tied to Amazon, but it's broader than that. And they're paying good wages. So they're pulling in those workers from manufacturing, right? There's a lot of manufacturing jobs that didn't used to pay even $15 an hour. There's a lot of manufacturing in that $13, $14, $15 an hour range. So they're able to take some of that labor. They're able to attract some of that labor from those low wage jobs in manufacturing. Manufacturing is not as high paying as you think, and pull them into the warehousing industry. Same thing with construction, pulling out of residential construction into the warehousing, pulling out of retail into the warehousing. If you're stocking shelves at a big box retailer, you can make a lot more money stocking shelves at the warehouse instead. And so they're able to draw in labor because they're paying better wages. And so I think that's one of the reasons why warehousing labor constraints, while not great, are not as bad as some of these other sectors, because they were also paying on the wage front. So what are you going to do? One other thing you can do if you're looking for labor from a business perspective is we have a lot of what we call the latent labor force. We wrote a report on this a few months back. You can find it online. There's a lot of people already in Oregon that aren't working, right? And so where could we look at some of these historical inequities and draw in additional workers into the labor market? From any, we modeled three scenarios. One would be look at gender equality, where we raise, employment rates of women up to match men, right? And that's going to require broader societal change in terms of childcare and daycare and flexible schedules and all that sort of stuff, right? For sure. But, there's a lot of potential increases there from a labor perspective, also from a race and ethnicity perspective, where if we started to see employment rates, particularly for Black Oregonians and American Indian Oregonians, if we raise those employment rates, that would boost the labor supply quite a bit. White, non-Hispanic, Asian, and Hispanic or Latino Oregonians basically work at roughly the same rates. But we really see some pockets of weakness and opportunities among Black Oregonians and American Indian Oregonians. And then the other one would be educational attainment, right? Raising educational attainment won't necessarily boost the number of workers a ton, but what it will do is boost wages, right? I think both for white non-Hispanic Oregonians and BIPOC Oregonians, people with college degrees earn 80% more, on an annualized basis than people without. And so it's a huge number, partly because it's not just the average wages, it's also the hours worked component too. That's how you get such a large increase in that 80%, but it's a huge number. And so raising educational attainment can provide for broader economic benefits as well. So with that, we'll focus a little bit more on the region. And this is also something that gets everywhere we go. People want to talk about, what's wrong with Portland? What's wrong with Portland? And part of it, frankly, is a perception issue, right? Not to downplay our societal challenges and our social ills. And we have white supremacists marching in our streets, and we have violence and protests, and we have a more visible homeless problem than we've ever had before and the like, right? We have social challenges, but we have to separate those distinct issues that we can work to address and underlying economic performance. And so if we focus just on the economic performance, what's wrong with Portland? Nothing. Nothing's wrong with Portland. Portland is behaving just like every other large metro in the entire country. Here we're looking at employment among the 56 metros in the US that have population of 1 million or more. Portland is right at the median today. Employment today in the region is just like it is elsewhere in the country. There's not really anything to report there. The bad news would be the very last sub bullet point is we trail all of our peer comparisons, right? The things that were identified by the Portland Business Alliance based upon research by Echo Northwest, Austin, Indianapolis, Salt Lake, Nashville, and Seattle, our employment trails all of those. Now, that's a really tough comparison group. Austin and Salt Lake are the two fastest growing metropolitan areas in the entire country. The top two, that's it, right? So that's a really hard benchmark to meet. But this is the group of cities and metros that we were in last decade, right? Portland was top 10 for high wage job growth, top 10 for educational attainment increases, top 10 for income growth. median household income growth. So this is the group that we used to be a part of. The question is, are we going to still be a part of that really high flying group? Or are we just going to see average, above average growth, but not exceptional growth this expansion? That's the real question, is a relative performance, not an absolute performance. Absolute performance, we're going to be above average. Question is whether we'll be a top flyer. So that's on the employment front. That's really what's going to be the driver of the economy moving forward. But if we look back at what's gone on in the pandemic so far, it's important to point out that local economic performance didn't really matter last year. Thanks to all that federal aid, thanks to the recovery rebates, the unemployment insurance benefits, the PPP loans and the like, they more than filled the hole associated with the economic declines from the pandemic and the shutdowns. And so last year, incomes grew everywhere, right? Incomes were up in every single county in Oregon, up in 98% of counties around the country because of that federal aid. Regardless of your job loss situation, regardless of your business income situation, total incomes are up because of that. And so you can see where focus first on the scatter plot on the right, you have wages and salaries in the gray dot. So the larger your job losses, the less wages you paid out or earned as a worker. Makes a lot of sense. But if you compare employment losses with total income, the blue dots, there's not that much of a relationship. You can see Portland Metro overall is right there in the middle of the pack. Washington County a little bit better, little bit stronger local economy, a little bit fewer job losses in Washington County than the region as a whole, but also saw smaller income gains. You can kind of see that on the chart on the left, where we're looking at income across Oregon counties. The two weakest counties that saw the smallest income growth last year in Oregon, Washington and Benton, right? A little counterintuitive. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is these are areas that have high incomes, right? You have higher incomes than the rest of the state. That means you rely on transfer payments. You rely on federal aid to a lesser degree. And so even though the increase in those transfer payments was just as large as it was everywhere, it's a smaller share of your income. And so therefore, conversely, look out east, right? Out east in Eastern Oregon, these are counties that saw income growth twice the national average, twice what it is. They saw 14% income growth, faster than like 95% of all counties in the US. But they're also starting from a lower base. And then they rely on transfer payments a little bit more with an older population. Those recovery rebates and the like made a percentage term a larger boost to their economy than it does, say, in Washington County, where the incomes are the highest, right? So it's really a relative, counterintuitive relative performance issue. It looks like, oh no, Washington County's the lowest. It's like, well, for a good reason. And Washington County residents receive just as big of an increase in this federal aid. It just accounts for a much smaller share of the local composition. But moving forward, it's going to be all about that job growth, and it's going to be all about population growth. And we just got, less than 48 hours ago, Tuesday night, Portland State released the 2021 population estimates for Oregon at the county level and the city level. And this is a little bit counterintuitive to what the conventional wisdom was, but this was built into our forecast. Our demographer in our office is great. He was on this from day one, from the start of the pandemic. He's held his guns the entire time, despite all the narrative of pandemic-related migration boom and driving the home sales environment, all that sort of stuff. Migration in 2021 was slower than migration in 2020, right? This is the direction, is low migration. People hunker down in recessions. Yeah, there was maybe some pandemic-related migration boom, but that wasn't enough to offset the traditional weakness we see in a weaker economy. And so population growth last year was slower than it's been in quite some time. And a lot of that had to do combination with the continued decline birth rate and the acceleration of deaths due to the pandemic weighed on that component of population growth more than it ever has before. And then the migration didn't rebound as some people were expecting, or some people were saying was happening. It just didn't from a macro level perspective. We look around the state county map on the right, 30 out of 36 counties grew last year. Two things stand out. One is Benton and Lane, right? So Eugene and Corvallis. I think there's some student related losses there because they only returned to campuses a couple months ago. They were off campus for a while. So I think that impacted the populations of Corvallis and Eugene. And then the Gorge, Hood River and the Dalles, or Wasco County, were down about 60 people each. So it's a stable population, just with a negative in front of it. That was a little bit of a surprise, but also not a tremendous decline. And then John Day, Grant County has been losing people slowly for quite some time now, and the like. So but we do expect population to ramp up in the years ahead as those job opportunities attract migrants like we have traditionally in Oregon's history. When we have job opportunities here, we tend to get people moving in for those opportunities and quality of life and the like. One update on some of the disparate impacts across the economy. I think there's good news and bad news. The bad news is we know we have historical inequities in our economy where we have those employment rates, particularly for Black Oregonians and American Indian Oregonians, with lower employment rates and lower wages and higher poverty and all that sort of stuff. And then also on the gender front, where women work significantly less than men do, in large part because it's mothers versus fathers, and fathers work at higher rates and mothers stay home at higher rates and the like. What has happened during the pandemic, we don't have Oregon data on this yet, but at the national level, these disparities have not widened, frankly, despite the narrative, despite the stuff you read in the paper. If you look at the data, they're all within a couple percentage points of each other. Not to make light of a couple percentage points, but given margin of error on the survey data and the like, I think these historical inequities did not widen this cycle, which they have traditionally widened during recessions, but they haven't. So that's a good news thing. But we'll continue to monitor these moving forward. Finally, here's that boom bust scenario, right? This is something that's increasingly likely. It is not very likely. It is not the baseline outlook as of today. But the concern is that we continue to boom and we continue this inflationary boom. And so starting next year, the Federal Reserve would, under this scenario, this alternative scenario, the Federal Reserve next year will raise interest rates more than anticipated to head off inflation. And traditionally, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, this would cause us to go back into recession, right? And that's that boom bust scenario there. And it's a pretty severe recession. Not as bad as the pandemic, not as bad as the Great Recession, but larger than other ones prior to that. And so it'd be a pretty severe recession anticipated here. 5-6% employment losses, takes a few years to come back out of it. And it wouldn't be until the end of the decade where that boom bust scenario would catch back up to the baseline outlook. And so that would be a big hit. What would that mean? That would mean incomes and tax revenues and business sales in the next 18 months are going to boom even more than anticipated, followed by a drop off. And that would be billions of dollars of lost revenue for the state budget, also millions or trillions for Oregon businesses at the same time. And so the thing to point out about that boom bust scenario is on that bust side, if that were to come to fruition, would we see the same level of federal aid we saw this cycle during the pandemic? I'm not sure, right? Traditionally, we don't really get any federal aid during recessions. We got whatever $600 checks during the Bush administration as we entered the Great Recession, and then we had a little stimulus package. People said the ARA, the American Reinvestment Act, was a huge stimulus package. It was not compared to the size of the Great Recession. But this time we saw massive amounts of federal aid. So it's going to kind of be that trajectory coming out of that bust will be all about that federal aid. Are we going to get recovery rebates again and all that sort of stuff or not? That's going to determine that overall trajectory. So bottom line, from a revenue perspective, if you're interested in this from a public resources perspective, we've raised revenues considerably, basically the last three or four forecasts. This time we're up $750 million. It's a couple percentage points. Obviously, $750 million is a lot of money in day-to-day operations, but as a percentage of the state budget, it's a percent or two. It's not a huge percentage increase, but it's a huge dollar increase in available resources. That is also, this forecast now is expected to trigger a kicker for this new budget period, which we wouldn't pay out until 2024. It's not a sure thing, given we still have 2 tax filing seasons to go, and tax filing seasons are going to be plus or minus a couple percent, even with that's an accurate forecast, is plus or minus a few percent. And so it's not a sure thing, but it is looking like this inflationary boom is more persistent and longer lasting than anticipated. We've raised the overall outlook over the extended forecast horizon as a result. We're expecting to be a level shift up in the trajectory of the economy and not coming back down, even if that boom bust scenario is now more in play. So that's everything I had brought this morning. I'm happy to take any questions or any additional thoughts. I would love to hear them. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh. That was absolutely fascinating. I think I saw a question come in during your presentation from Paul Matthews. how much of the increase in income it is the result of the higher paying jobs coming back faster than lower paying jobs? Any, none, or some?
So initially, that increase in the average wage, like in March, April, May of 2020, initially that increase in the average wage was entirely due to the compositional effect I think you're getting at, where the people who lost their jobs were predominantly almost entirely low wage workers. And so if you look at the average wage of who kept their job, it rose because we dropped a lot of the low wage workers out of the calculation. Since then, as we've added some more of those low wage jobs back, that is now about 80% of that wage. So wages are up 15%. And I would say 12% of that is underlying wage growth on a adjusted basis. And 3% of that was still that compositional issue where we still have fewer workers at the bars and the restaurants and the like. So at this point, it's predominantly all economic growth, and that compositional issue is mostly gone at this point.
Thank you. And our next question is, are PPP funds included in the record corporate profits may be artificially elevated due to PPP impact?
They would be in there. Now, the chart specifically used are corporations and C corps at that, which did not get that many PPP loans. Most of the PPP loans went to S corps and pass-through entities, and that would not be counted there. But yes, that is part of it. And just as another note, with the PPP in the record business-related revenues we're seeing, both again on the C corp side and the pass-through entity side, is the PPP was supposed to be a double deduction, where the PPP loans weren't taxed themselves; they shouldn't have been. And then as you use those PPP loans to pay payroll or rent or whatever, that's also a business expense. So you deduct that off of your taxable stuff. And so the PPP was supposed to have like a double whammy impact on revenues. And if that's actually in the data, then I flabbergasted at the corporate related revenues that we're seeing. And so we're worried about a hangover there from just a mechanical perspective. The SBA didn't approve the grant, switching it from the loan to the grant. They didn't approve that in time, and so it's going to show up on a future tax year when you get to actually take the deductions and the like. And so I think we're worried about a hangover there. But even with that, they're very, very strong.
Thank you. And our next question, do you see any impact of pent-up demand or spending in certain industries, for example, healthcare, as a result of people staying at home during the pandemic?
Yes, we're already seeing it in some categories, right? If you look at the spending on going out to eat, we've just in the last 3 months have fully reverted to the old trend for money on going out to eat. Now the volume, the prices are up a little bit, right? So maybe we're not physically going out to eat quite as much as we used to, but the amount we're spending has. So the going out to eat is fully back. But the healthcare you bring up is really the weakness that people aren't talking about, right? We still have a hole in the economy related to healthcare spending, and it's two things. One is it's nursing homes or residential care facilities that's included in the category, and those are down. And I think it's a good story and a bad story in that part of it probably is we have fewer residents due to the pandemic. But the other part is you could see it immediately is people pulled their loved ones out of these facilities immediately as the pandemic hit, right? They pulled because they were hotspots, and so people, there's fewer residents in these care facilities, so therefore spending in healthcare overall is down. That's the one component. The other component is the elective surgeries component. And so employment at hospitals, employment at ambulatory care facilities and the like is still down despite breaching capacity at some of these facilities due to the pandemic. With the elective surgeries down, that's hurting the margins and the revenue, and employment is down overall in the healthcare industry for that reason too. So will that come back? I think so, right? Is there going to be pent-up demand? Are you going to get two plastic surgeries next year to make up for the one you didn't get during the pandemic? I'm not sure. But I do think that stuff will come back. But I don't know when. Obviously we need to clear a lot of space in our hospitals from the pandemic related stuff to free up the space and the workers' time. But I would expect that to come back at some point for sure.
Thank you. And our next question is, at what point do rising housing costs in Oregon begin to impact immigration and or state job growth?
Huge. That's been the number one issue at the top of our list for frankly the last decade. And what we've seen is our terrible housing affordability is not forcing people on net to pack up and leave. If you live in Oregon, you're not like, this rent increase or these home prices are so bad, I'm just going to leave. And that's happened to some people, sure, but it's happened the same thing in California where people are like, I'm going to leave California and move to Oregon because so like on net, we're not seeing particularly low income households move out on net. We're seeing low income households on net continue to move into Oregon. But I think where the housing costs really play is that initial decision of where you're going to move. I think it's an initial repellent, right? Where it's like, okay, if I'm moving, I'm 20 years old, I'm just leaving home, or I'm 35 and I'm starting a family and we need to have a house or whatever. If you're looking around where you're going to move, it's like, well, maybe Boise, maybe Reno looks better than Portland or Seattle or something like that. So it's that initial decision, I think, is where the housing costs are really a repellent, not so much as we're kicking people out yet. But of course, they're doing that in California. So if that's the path we're on, if we're not going to build enough housing, which we haven't, if that's the path we're going to continue to go down, then maybe that's what we'll see moving forward at some point.
Thank you. And our next question is, has our port benefited from the supply chain issues at Long Beach, California? And if not, why not?
It's a good question. I don't know the exact answer. My guess would be, to the extent that they have benefited, it'd be marginal. Now, okay, so I will say this. We do know with the port, with the container ship backups, we've seen increased people trying to get on the rails and increased air freight traffic overall. But those are backed up too. So given that we do have, air freight capacity in Portland region, that could be a little bit of a benefit to the port. But on the container side, no, because these are just massive ships. You can't get those ships up the Columbia River, right across the bar. The Columbia Bar is a traditional breakneck point. The dredging and the depth of the Columbia, plus the Port of Portland is 100 miles, river miles from the ocean, right? So you can't get these big ships through there. And so I don't think the container issues would have really benefited Portland. Maybe it did Seattle a little bit, and it certainly did like Savannah. People started going around the Panama Canal and go over to Georgia or New York or something like that. But we just can't get those ships up the river.
Thank you. I'm just checking to see if we have any additional questions. I want to make sure I didn't leave any out. I don't see any additional questions, but I'll keep my eye on the chat and the Q&A if anybody pops in. But assuming no additional questions, Josh, I'll give you the last word before we wrap up, and really appreciate your time this morning. Yeah,
no. Thanks for having me. Great to be here. Sometime I'll see your faces again. But again, overall things are good, right? We have different problems this cycle. This entire cycle is different. Before it was people didn't have money, there weren't job opportunities. We were trying to grind our way out of a financial crisis. This time we're in an inflationary boom. The challenges are more on those supply constraints and production costs and finding workers, which is something we haven't seen. Again, we haven't seen this in 2 generations. And so it's an interesting cycle. I think it's a better cycle to be in than certainly what we came out of last time. So overall good news, just different challenges for sure.
Thank you so much. We know our attendees always look forward to having you. And so we look forward to welcoming you back in 2022. I would like to recognize again our sponsors, our presenting sponsor, Kaiser Permanente, and our series sponsor, Legacy Health. We are also not quite done with 2021. We do have some upcoming events in December. Also be on the lookout for a December forum. We are working on finalizing a date sometime the week of December 13th. And I would just like to wrap up again, thanking you for your time. We know how valuable it is. We appreciate you sharing it with us, and have a wonderful rest of your week, a very healthy, happy, safe Thanksgiving holiday, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us.